Peace, 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 peace. It's you know, you know who it is. You know, we learn nothing about history, nothing at all. We get this idea that we've paid attention to history and schools are teaching us history. Nah, these places teach us to be slaves. They indoctrinate us to be slaves, especially in the South. One of the things I learned is, you know, the schools in the South don't teach the same way that they teach in the North. Um, and all that shit is unconstitutional. You know, the fact that they have all this stuff here and we didn't even know, like Christian black codes, right? Look at this. Christian black codes of 1724. Extensive breakdown coming. The Christian black codes of 1724 were initiated during the Reconstruction after the Civil War to control blacks after they were emancipated. Emancipated? Civil War? Passed by southern states. Instead of giving blacks the same rights as whites, the codes limited the blacks' freedom severely. Let's read this though. Black codes were restrictive laws designated to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as cheap labor forced after slavery was abolished during the Civil War. Though the Union victory had given some 4 million slaves their freedom, the question of freed black status in the post-war Southern was still very much unresolved. Under black codes, many states required blacks to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. Outrage over black codes helped undermine support for President Andrew Johnson and Republican Party. So look at this. This came from the History Channel, right? Tell me it's not reputable. Original, 2010, 10 years ago, and they updated it. Reconstruction began when President Abraham Lincoln announced the impending passage of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The stakes of Civil War shifted dramatically. A Union victory would mean no less than revolution in the South, where the particular institution of slavery had dominated economic, political, and social life in the antebellum years. In April 1865, as the war drew to a close, Lincoln shocked many by proposing limited suffrage of African Americans in the South. He was assassinated days later. However, his successor, Andrew Jackson, would be the one to preside over the beginning of Reconstruction. As you know, the years following Reconstruction, the South reestablished many of the provisions of the Black Codes form of in the form of the so-called Jim Crow laws. These remained firmly in place for almost a century, but were finally abolished with the passage of Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, they claim that these things were abolished and went away, right? They claim that. But is that what really happened? Is that what you see when you see black people getting shot up or choked out in the street over a cigarette, or, shot for sitting in a car? Is that what we're watching? Or are we watching something different? Because sometimes we pretend that it's just, oh, they're being racist, or maybe it's some systematic thing that these people, put in place. You ever thought about that? Even as former slaves fought to assert their independence and gain economic autonomy during the earliest years of Reconstruction, white landowners, which I don't think any European can own land here in America, I will say that, acted to control the labor force through a system similar to the one that had existed during slavery. So, whatever. To that end, in late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted the first black codes. Mississippi law requires blacks to have written evidence of employment for the coming year each January. If they left before the end of the contract, they would be forced to forfeit earlier wages and were subject to arrest. What you doing around here, boy? Is this car stolen? People be like, oh, that stuff ended. Where? Where did it end? Alright, let's see. Impact of black codes. Restrictive nature of the codes and widespread black resistance to their enforcement enraged many in the North who argued that the codes violated the fundamental principles of free labor ideology. After passing the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto, the Republicans in Congress effectively took control of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection of the Constitution to former slaves, and enacted universal male suffrage before they could rejoin the Union. Some people say to me, a lot of more say the 14th Amendment wasn't ratified. I have to do more study on that, because when you Google it, it doesn't really come up, because I guess it's not really common knowledge yet, or it's a lie. I think you would have to go to the Congress website to find that information. But who knows? The 15th Amendment, adopted in 1870, guaranteed that citizens' rights to vote would not be denied on account of race, color, or perceived conditions of servitude. During this period of radical Reconstruction, 1867 to 1877, blacks won election to southern states governments, and even to the U.S. Congress. As indicated by the passage of the Black Codes, however, white Southerners showed a steadfast commitment to ensuring their supremacy and the survival of plantation agriculture in the post-war years. Support for Reconstruction policies waned after the early 1870s, undermined by the violence of white supremacist organizations such as KKK. Like I said, those words. By 1877, when the last federal soldiers left the South and Reconstruction drew to a close, blacks had seen little improvement in their economic and social status. And I'm not gonna lie, South is a beautiful, beautiful place, man. But there's some real crazy, shady shit going on out here. And Lord willing, this stuff is remedied, Lord willing. Let's look at this. There's something here that I want to show you guys. But I got
white people did not exist before 1681. Again, white people did not exist on planet Earth until...
Hold on, so 2014. Just ain't no new shit. You know what I'm saying? Let's keep on going.
Till 1681. Number two, any claim that this group called white people, any claim that that group is rooted in biology or derived from genes or biology or is innate or is from nature is a lie. Third and final point. As a matter of foundational law, actually, let me say it this way. White supremacy has been embedded in the United States of America from its founding as a matter of law.
Now, I'm not going to say that the founding fathers was pushing white supremacy, but they knew that there was people that were amongst them, not in the Masonry, not in Freemasonry, not in none of that. But I'm not going to say that they wasn't in Freemasonry, but that was pushing these ideologies of being supreme over the world. Finding God's land, finding America, coming here, it's powerful. They say you go anywhere in the world, there's no place like that, like America. The Americas, I would say.
Now, I don't expect you to buy all that, to get all that, to believe all that, at least not now. But my job is to share with you the legal history that proves each of those three claims that I begin with. So let's go. Let's get started. We have to begin this conversation in colonial North America, specifically in the colonies, the British colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Both were British colonies, and both shared a number of particular characteristics. First, their economies were rooted in tobacco farming. If you know much about tobacco farming, it requires tremendous human labor. Lots and lots of workers. So those who owned large plantations, big landholders, constantly needed laborers to do the work to grow the tobacco. In addition to sharing an economic base, both colonies had an incredible gender imbalance, roughly 10 men for every woman. Now, let's understand a little bit about the folks who constitute the people in these two colonies. Oh, and by the way, let me give you a year. We're in the early 1600s, okay, the early part of the 17th century, colonial North America. England had, for some bizarre reason that today demographers cannot explain, there was a population boom in England in the early 17th century. So there were lots and lots of poor British people who were on the public doles, who couldn't find a way to make a living, who couldn't feed themselves. So the king in England was quite happy to have them sign a contract of indenture to then go work in the British colonies. And that is what happened. Both indentured and enslaved persons, according to historian Edmund Morgan, were sold and traded like cattle. But of course, not all laborers stand equal in terms of their labor agreement or lack thereof. Those who came under a term of indenture worked for a term of years, and presumably this indenture was an agreement that they chose to enter into. The terms of indenture were largely protected by British law, although the terms that took form in colonial North America were quite different than those that existed in England. For example, in England, indentured servants could marry because that was viewed as the way to produce the next group of workers. In this country, indentured servants were prohibited from marrying, and if women were unfortunate enough to get pregnant during their term of indenture, they added usually about 7 to 9 years onto their term of indenture and 1 year to the father. Slavery, of course, was a status that came with life, work for life. There was neither British law nor international law to prohibit or restrict slavery. What we do know is that at this time period in colonial North America, there were free persons of African descent. We know that landholders freed slaves. They did so in wills. They did so by allowing them to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of a family member. The vast majority of workers, laborers, in colonial North America at this time were British men, British workers, the vast majority.
So what she's saying is the actual slaves were British men. Are y'all paying attention? Are you paying attention? Go back.
Laborers in colonial North America at this time were British men, British workers.
So in the 1500s, 1600s, she's letting you know that actual slaves weren't the indigenous of the land. They were actually the Europeans first.
Vast majority. There were some women, there were some European laborers from Portuguese, Dutch, folks from Ireland.
The show, The American Gods, it kind of alludes to that the Europeans were slaves here in America. So.
And from Scotland are also revealed in the records, but the vast majority were British men. There were small numbers of persons of African descent, and there were even smaller numbers of members of native tribes. But in this slide, I'm trying to capture the socioeconomic ladder, and really that ladder should be about as long as this room. The landholding elite are, in today's parlance, that's the 1%. And the vast majority of folks who were in the colonies were laborers. Again, they were British, other Europeans, Africans, and members of native tribes. Here's what I find folks have the most difficult time with. We tend to really struggle with getting a good picture of social life, the social context at this juncture. We're very good at understanding the social relations that exist later, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But pre-Bacon's Rebellion society is something that we generally in this country struggle to grasp. So I'm going to do my best to paint a broad stroke picture of this time period. What we know is that British and African laborers worked, ate, and slept together. Furthermore, the evidence from this period, which covers the first 3/4 of the 17th century, that the anecdotal evidence reveals that they lived under similar conditions and faced the same opportunities and chances to make it once one was free of their term of service, whether free of enslavement or free of indenture. So let's review this. British laborers constituted the vast majority of the population.
So think about it. So what happened? You have the British coming over here in the 1600s from the 1400s, right? You have them coming over here, setting up, they're building up their country. They're seeing, the indigenous here. They're bringing over their slaves, the pilgrims. They're coming over here, setting up their stuff. They see that these people that they come in contact with are very civilized. They're not savages or whatever. And they start saying, hold up, our own leaders are horrible to us from across the water. And the people that we're following or are here with on this land, they're civilized. They let us here. They let us have these 13 colonies. They let us be here. Let's separate from the British. Think about it. Let's separate from the British. 1776. Some of the paperwork, some of the stuff says the indigenous helped them come up with their constitution. So, as they start doing that, what do you think the British are going to do? They're going to start sending their infiltrators. They're going to start sending their dissenters. They're going to start sending their warmongers. Think about this. If before the Constitution in the 1600s, slaves were able to get free and start their own stuff. Now, where was the systems that were there?
Populations in both colonial Maryland and colonial Virginia. All men, of course, because the law of coverture, let me tell you something about that law of coverture. The law of coverture is derived from British common law, and it structures marriage. And this is how Barrister Blackstone famously described the law of coverture. In marriage, the man and the woman become one, and the one is the man. You didn't have the right to retain your own wages. You couldn't create estate planning, wills, or trusts without the approval of a man. So all men who were free of indenture or enslavement faced the same opportunities in these colonies as a matter of law.
Mind you, she says in these colonies, because they don't speak on the Iroquois Confederation. They don't speak on the Native Americans and what they had here. They will never speak on that.
For example, free men of African descent could own servants or slaves, and they did. They could vote, and they did. They could marry persons of the opposite sex. God, and I love that I have to make that qualification now. Woo! They could marry persons of the opposite sex regardless of national origin, and they did. In fact, marriages between men of African descent and women primarily of British descent were not uncommon at all. In one county, 1/2 of the free men of African descent were married to a European woman. There was a challenge.
But the question is why? Why was the people here marrying these European women? Is it because they look better? No, the women was seducing the men because they knew that they owned property. How do you finagle property? Marriage.
To these marriages, but it did not come from the masses. It came from elites, and that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, this little depiction is meant to be a depiction of the lawmakers in Maryland, colonial Maryland lawmakers. They passed a law in 1664 punishing, and I quote, British and other freeborn women who marry enslaved Negro men. The punishment for entering into these marriages was that the woman herself would be enslaved for her husband's life, and any children they have would be enslaved into their 20s. Now imagine that you are a plantation owner. That's not a bad deal. I get more property. I like that. And that is exactly what happened. Rather than deter these marriages, which is the express intent of the law of 1664, rather than deter them, these marriages were encouraged by property owners because that, in fact, that such a marriage increased their property value.
See?
This law of 1664 represents, if not the first, certainly the precursor to anti-miscegenation law. These are laws that punished or prohibited marriage between, notice that white people didn't exist yet in 1664, at least as referenced in that law. But most generally speaking, anti-miscegenation law prohibited and punished marriages between a white person and a specific non-white person or persons. Let me be really clear. I read all the time in history books, in academic texts, and I read anti-miscegenation law described as prohibiting interracial marriage. That's not correct. For example, a member of a native tribe could marry a person of Chinese descent. Both were understood as racially distinct, but never did anti-miscegenation law prohibit such kinds of marriages. The only marriages that anti-miscegenation law prohibited were those between a white person and always a person of African descent, and sometimes various other groups. Okay, so just so we're really clear about anti-miscegenation law and its link to whiteness. A couple other things to note about anti-miscegenation law. It's not derived from British law. Anytime we look at law and study history and you see a break from British common law, you always want to pay attention because it tells us something about the needs and desires of those who wielded power in the colonial context. So anti-miscegenation law was one of these laws. They were passed colony by colony and then state by state. It's a really important area of law for a number of reasons. But for our purpose this morning is because it's where this human category called white first appears on planet Earth, the first time. In addition, anti-miscegenation law is important because it lasted more than 300 years. These anti-miscegenation laws literally shaped the faces of this group of more than 2,000 X number of people that I'm looking at today. The Maryland legislature sought to correct for the encouragement of marriages that they described in that previous law of 1664 as, quote, a disgrace, unquote, to the British people, as an indication that the, quote, British or freeborn woman must be forgetful of her status as free, end quote. So they passed the law of 1681, and in this law, it made it illegal for British and other white women from marrying a Negro slave. And furthermore, the law punished any landholder who encouraged the marriages and any religious authority who performed it. This law equals the invention of the human category white.
See, most of this shit is about the British trying to have control over people. You can do and say whatever we allow you to do and say. You can't be other than that. This is what they're telling you. This is what she's telling you. The British got control.
Did these group of laborers, some of whom were from Portugal, some from Holland, some from Ireland, Scotland, did they have a little genetic transformation that occurred right after the General Assembly in Maryland met, creating a genetic sludge that we can now call white? Virginia passed its first anti-miscegenation law in 1691. In Virginia, the law prohibited both white men and white women from marrying a person of African descent or a member of a native tribe. But lest I leave you thinking that gender equality was being created in this law, let me quickly dispel that. Studies of antebellum courts reveal that, in fact, anti-miscegenation law was that, at least in the language of the law, prohibited these marriages for white men and white women. But here's what we know from antebellum court cases. We know that plenty of white men married and or engaged in intimate sexual relations with prohibited women. However, very rarely were they brought to court and punished under the anti-miscegenation law. Very rarely. So here, pay attention to this. This law, in its enforcement, is largely focused on controlling the relationality and the sexuality of white women and non-white men. Furthermore, think about the enforcement practices that come out of this particular law. What's the result? Who becomes more available for who? We see a further step in locating patriarchal power squarely among and within white men. We've talked about the law of 1664 and the amendment to that law in 1681. And we've noted that the key difference between those two is the reference to the group who's of concern. The language has shifted from British and other freeborn to British and other white women in that particular law. So the question becomes, well, what the heck happened between 1664 and 1681? And the answer is Bacon's Rebellion. This was a massive revolt in the colony of Virginia that lasted more than a year. Let me give some background of the seeds of this rebellion, what helped give rise to this violent outburst. Those who were enslaved, I don't think it's hard to imagine, were by definition of their status disgruntled laborers. And remember that pool of readily available workers from England who were poor and happily sent off in the guts of ships? Well, they dried up. That population surge ended, and there was no longer a pool of laborers from Britain available to handle the work on the plantations in the colonies.
All right, so what happened? They went after indigenous people. Easy. That's all they did. Went after indigenous people. After the British started doing that, let's get these people to do the work for us. All right, I'm going to finish this video tomorrow for you guys. I feel like this video is getting kind of long already. Yeah. So, yeah, man. You have to learn the history in order to dispel the mystery. All right, guys. With that, like, subscribe, and share my shit. Biatch. Peace.